Okay, now today you wanted to talk about your views on censorship.
Yes, well, I've thought about censorship a lot. Censorship's probably one of the more complicated subjects that you can discuss within the political sphere, and what should be censored and what the public should be able to view. Because obviously, and a lot of people don't realise, there's a lot of heinous content out there which you can be exposed to on the internet. When I was a teenager, I think it was about 2005 that they really cracked down on what content was readily available on the internet in Australia, and a lot of websites were banned. There was some censorship laws that were brought in to deal with inappropriate content on the internet. You can go and look up exactly when those laws were brought in, but before that, when I was in early high school and late primary school, when the internet was just coming online for everyone. We still had dial-up at the time. This is 1999, 2000. You could still view a lot of this really graphic content. And when I was a teenager, I was exposed to some of that stuff. I saw some snuff videos of soldiers getting executed in war zones and stuff. Once saw a guy get a knife pushed into his throat and it killed him. It was a terrible thing. So footage like that can be very traumatic, and yes, I do feel it traumatized me. But I also used to watch war footage, which was available even more recently during the Afghan-Iraq wars. There was a lot of soldiers who were putting up head cam and body cam footage in the combat field. Now, I think a lot of that is gone now. I think it's been taken off the internet, at least in this country. And I watched that because I wanted to understand what it was like to be a soldier on the battlefield. I wanted to empathise with soldiers on the battlefield and try and grasp what it's like to be in a war zone. So a lot of that footage used to be readily available, and I've seen quite a bit of that sort of content. And I weigh up with myself all the time whether this footage should be publicly available, because it can really, seeing graphic violence and gore content can really warp people psychologically, and it can cause trauma. But it also, I feel that having been exposed to some of that content gives me a more realistic view of the world, and helps me to understand that there is very bad violence that exists in the world. So, you used to be able to see videos of terrorist groups beheading people and soldiers in combat, and you realise, we don't see these things every day in Australia. There aren't men walking down the streets with machine guns in Australia. There aren't machine guns firing everywhere and bombs going off in Australia. We're a very privileged nation in that way. Things are relatively more safer here for the most part. Most members of the community aren't exposed to warfare and conflict. So viewing footage like that can really help you empathise with people who live in those parts of the world where there is constant warfare. So I do feel being exposed to footage of warfare and violence has informed my view of the world and given me a more realistic, it's a cold, dark, negative view of the world I have in many cases, because I understand how much bad violence there is out there. But it's also a more realistic view of the realities of the world, especially for people in other countries which aren't as stable as Australia, because that's what they talk about. This is a stable country. It's all about stability and security. It's interesting because we're allowed. There's a lot of this stuff we're not allowed to look at because it's deemed traumatic and offensive. But we're allowed to look at pictures of the Holocaust, and we're allowed to look at the Jews in the concentration camps and the bodies being piled into mass graves. We acknowledge that atrocity, and we don't hide from that atrocity. So we're allowed to view that, and we consider that educational, that historical footage of World War II and the atrocities committed against the Jews and other ethnic groups and minorities. The other thing is, the Vietnam War, the first televised war, the first war that was broadcast all over the world with journalists in the battlefield filming what was happening. And it's because the Vietnam War was so heavily broadcast and televised and reported on that members of the public, particularly in America, were exposed to the realities of what the US government was doing leading that war, and they rose up in protest to shut that war down. Now, it still took a little while to get the war shut down, but you could argue that without that war being televised, there wouldn't have been the mass social public upheaval in America and around the world that led to the American government eventually pulling out of Vietnam. So, you know, it's an interesting subject because we don't want people to be traumatized, and sometimes seeing graphic violent content can cause people to start behaving violently. But also we want people to have a realistic understanding of the world, and the reality is there is war and death and murder and atrocities all over the world, everywhere. And for many people around the world, that's day-to-day life. You know, imagine being in Ukraine now. The whole country's a war zone. People are seeing people get blown up, and car bombs and bombs going off, and machine guns firing everywhere you go, and death and destruction. For some people, that is their day-to-day life. Certainly not the case in Australia. We haven't got any open warfare in the streets in Australia. So, you know, sometimes I think Australians are very, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not aware of how hard life can be for some people in other parts of the world where these things are happening, and they're a bit, you know, oblivious to the realities that some people live their whole lives surrounded by violence and warfare and conflict. So it could be educational to some people who haven't been exposed to that stuff to see this sort of graphic war content, like the Vietnam War footage influenced people in America who otherwise wouldn't have known how tragic and awful the Vietnam War was, and wouldn't have risen up in protest to have it shut down. So I think there's something to be said for having a dark and scary but realistic view of the world through seeing, you know, heinous, horrible, atrocious footage of beheadings and executions and gunfights and warfare. I think there's definitely something to be said that can inform your view of the world. I think the Australian government doesn't want people to have that sort of informed view of the world. You know, in Australia, that sort of content is very heavily censored in this country, and we have some pretty strict censorship laws in this country. So I think the position of consecutive Australian governments is we don't want people to know about that stuff. And I get that because, you know, it's so scary and it's so dark and it's so traumatic, but it's also real. You know, that's what goes on out in the world, and these things happen. You know, it's just crazy. I remember about 10 years ago I can't remember where it was, I think it might have been Libya or one of these countries, but there was a case where some homosexual people were stoned to death for being homosexual, and I sort of thought, well, Jesus, that sort of thing still happens in the world. And there are places where you could live where you do the wrong thing and you'll get stoned to death and you'll get murdered and persecuted. So I think it can be informative to understand that not everyone, some people are subject to these sorts of incidences and this sort of war and violence, and to empathise with them and to understand their suffering. Especially when, you know, it's especially relevant to talking about refugees, because everybody bangs on about how we don't want them in this country. But if Australians only understood what it's like to escape a massacre, they might have a little bit more empathy for those people we let into the country who have escaped heinous violence and persecution and death and suffering. But, you know, the average Australian just spends their day at work, then with their family, then they go to the pub and have a beer. You know, there's no massacres and genocides happening. Well, there are some happening here, but in the day-to-day walking down the street, we're not seeing bombs going off. We're not seeing people getting shot. So I think if Australians were a bit more exposed to those realities of cruelty and violence, they might be a bit more empathetic towards people who we welcome into this country who have come from those environments. So yeah, you know, it's interesting. What should people be allowed to view? What sort of content should people be allowed to view? Should people be allowed to study war and violence and conflict? And, you know, you're allowed to read about murderers, but you're not allowed to watch them doing the act. And I understand that because it's offensive. But, you know, if you really want to understand the violence in the world and the nature of violence in the world, you can't hide from it. You know, I don't hide from the reality of violence in the world. I've seen and been exposed to enough content relating to violence in the world to understand that we live in a very violent world, and I don't hide from that. And I think a lot of Australians aren't hiding from it. I think they're just oblivious to it. So there is something to be said for viewing that sort of content from an educational perspective. So have a think about what you think Australians should be allowed to view and what they shouldn't be allowed to view, and what your position is on censorship.